Is a carbon tax an efficient way to curb carbon emissions? I'm Eric Miller, and this is Scholar's Mate. Hello, and welcome to Scholar's Mate. I'm your host, Eric Miller. With climate change gaining prominence as a major political issue, some experts are proposing a carbon tax as a possible compromise to mitigate greenhouse gas emissions. Currently, there are 5 federal carbon tax proposals introduced by both House and Senate members in the U.S. Congress. But what exactly is a carbon tax? Here's an explainer from Policy Ed.
What if we could reduce carbon pollution at a lower cost and with fewer government restrictions than we have now? Our current strategy is to regulate who, what, or how energy can be used, either through emissions rules that favor politically connected groups or through costly subsidies and mandates that often fail to achieve their goals. But another, more flexible way is to tax carbon emissions. A carbon tax would automatically encourage consumers and producers to shift toward energy choices that emit less carbon, whatever those options may be, because they would cost less relative to high carbon options. Economists call this an efficient solution because those who create costs would pay for them instead of shifting it onto others. This carbon tax could be made revenue neutral and more fair to all income groups by taking all revenue collected and redistributing it to American taxpayers in the form of an equal annual dividend check. Most importantly, a revenue-neutral carbon tax would reduce carbon emissions at a lower cost than today's arbitrary and complex regulatory limits. Winners and losers wouldn't depend on being politically connected. They would be determined by who uses or saves the most carbon.
So, is a carbon tax an efficient way to curb carbon emissions? Joining us to discuss the issue is Jordan McGillis, a Paulson policy analyst at the Manhattan Institute. Before joining Manhattan Institute, Jordan was the Deputy Director of Policy at the Institute for Energy Research. At Manhattan Institute, his work touches on energy, environment, housing, and transportation. Jordan's work has appeared in the National Review, the American Spectator, Breakthrough Journal, and City Journal. And also joining us is Alex Muresianu, a federal analyst at Tax Foundation. He attended Tufts University, graduating with a degree in economics and minors in finance and political science. Alex also worked for the Pioneer Institute, spent a summer as a journalism intern at Reason magazine, and has written op-eds for various print and online publications. Gentlemen, thank you both for joining us.
Our pleasure.
Thank you for having me.
So Alex, tell us why a carbon tax is a good way of reducing carbon emissions.
So I think we start out with, I would say, if you were going to build a case, I think point zero is, as we said in the introduction, that, climate change, is an important issue that is, will come with significant costs for the United States and the rest of the world. But of course, it's not the only issue. We have other considerations at hand as well. And so when we think about how to address climate change and how we've addressed it so far, it's been through a mix of policies usually targeted at specific industries or sectors, a mix of regulations and subsidies that are, not really uniform across the economy, and as such are vulnerable to, political capture or otherwise just poor use of resources. And so what a carbon tax does is present a cross-the-economy approach that is neutral by activity, that it is only concerned with carbon emissions and not with, establishing something specific for different industries. And then I think the additional, so you can see with a carbon tax, because it is sort of broad and neutral, it tends to be much more efficient. The cost of reducing emissions of a carbon tax relative to, say, weatherization programs to reduce emissions from structures, from building structures, or regulations on car emissions and fuel standards and whatnot. Carbon taxes tend to reduce emissions by much more per dollar of economic cost. And then I think the third point, and the third point here with the carbon tax is that the revenue just doesn't disappear. You have revenue to do a lot of other things. For instance, we do have increasingly high deficits, and if that's a concern, then a carbon tax is certainly one way to go about it, reducing the deficit. But in my view, I think the more important thing to do with revenue would be to sort of fundamentally restructure the tax code in favor of investment. And I think with the combination of other tax reductions, you can have a net positive effect on the economy as well, which is not something that can be said for a lot of other green policies, which tend to, which don't produce that sort of opportunity. So there are a few sort of policy combinations that could produce sort of both significantly improved environment and pro-growth and sort of increasing economic growth broadly, and a carbon tax with proper sort of uses of revenue to further reform the tax code is one of those policies that can.
Jordan, how would you respond to some of the points that Alex has made?
First, I would say I greatly respect Alex's work on this topic and that of the Tax Foundation more broadly. I think that you do excellent analysis in illustrating how different forms of carbon tax revenue recycling will affect our economy for better or for worse. But I want to look at some more fundamental issues. In our explainer video, what we discussed was this allegedly revenue neutral approach to a carbon tax. And what we actually tend to see in practice is that revenue gets splashed around in a variety of different directions. We create new spending programs, and we end up not having the positive effects that we see in the beautiful Blackboard case that you draw up. A recent piece that you wrote in National Review that you expanded on in a longer report talked about using revenue to reduce corporate taxes, perhaps incentivize R&D, those sorts of things. And you said the great thing is the revenue doesn't disappear, but the thing is, here in Washington, we all know $100 million can't walk up K Street without getting mugged. That revenue is going to get pulled apart by lobbyists, by various entrenched political interests, and probably most significantly by the political problem that you're going to have with this policy proposal of people seeing higher energy bills, higher gas prices, and then hearing that it's been affixed to some form of a corporate tax break. So that seems like a big problem for you politically. My approach to climate change, which I agree is an issue that does require a look from our body politic, my approach is to find areas where our existing policies are exacerbating emissions and or incentivizing us to use energy in a wasteful or higher emitting way. A couple of areas that come to mind for me are very relevant to my organization, the Manhattan Institute, which focuses a lot on urban policy, zoning, and transportation. With residential single-family zoning, which predominates across this country, we are effectively incentivizing and subsidizing the spread of our lifestyle across broader and broader swaths of territory, which requires more energy and concomitantly more emissions for people to get around town. Another area that I would challenge you more directly on is the applicability of what we call in our industry the Pigovian approach to taxation, the applicability of that to this specific form of externality. As you and I both know, in the neoclassical economic models, we're able to assess what the cost to society broadly is of a given economic behavior that might exceed what someone's paying in the market. And we call that an externality. It can be positive or it can be negative. Emissions of local air pollutants or of greenhouse gases are generally considered to be negative emissions and quite significant in some cases. So the model that you're proposing would attempt to internalize that negative externality, make that price visible to everyday consumers and households, firms as well, and alter behavior in that way. But the big problem here is that our laws only extend to the extent of our borders. There's a major international relations component to the climate change question. We don't have a great means of coercing, to name one big country, China, in this direction, but there are a lot of countries beyond China that we'd love to see get richer, get more prosperous. Are we going to be applying a border carbon tax to countries like India, Indonesia, that are mired in poverty and could really use some of the benefits of affordable energy that they have from things like coal and natural gas?
Alex, how would you respond?
Yeah, so I think there are some great points made there. I certainly agree with you about housing and transportation policy. Zoning reform would make it a lot easier to, for people to live in more walkable, communities. And additionally, and this is something that is an issue in the tax code as well, there's also a structural bias in favor of single-family homes over typically commercially run residential structures. And multifamily housing tends to be much more energy efficient. And I agree with you on road pricing and how we fund roads. But I think that those are, I think with zoning reform, I think at a national scale that can be difficult to accomplish as well. I think there are political challenges to unraveling the sort of local control that we have in the current status quo as well. Certainly a fight worth having, but it's also a political challenge. And then on the carbon border adjustment question and carbon taxes in a globalized economy, the idea with a carbon border adjustment is to shift the tax base of a carbon tax away from domestic production and towards domestic consumption. And so in a border adjustment, you would have, say, international imports coming in would be taxed on their carbon content, and the tax on American exporters would be exempt from the carbon tax for the emissions from the production of their exports. And so what this does is shift the base of the carbon tax from all domestic production to all domestic consumption. And this is not a sort of tariff or protectionist measure because both markets are neutral. So no matter what, if you are international or domestic, if you are selling goods in the United States, you're subject to the tax, and if you're selling goods outside of the United States, you're not subject to the tax. And so the idea here is to get at the problem of carbon leakage, basically, where if you have a tax on domestic production, then instead of reducing carbon emissions broadly, which is what you ultimately care about, production of carbon-intensive goods will just move abroad, and that's a real concern, especially if politicians are more concerned about bringing manufacturing jobs back. There are a lot of strategic, not necessarily economic reasons, as well as economic reasons for that concern today. And so a carbon border adjustment is one way to help deal with that. And I think internationally, I think that is a fair concern that it would impact, developing countries. But at the same time, I think in other ways it would, as the global sort of community gets more worried about carbon tax. A carbon tax in the U.S. Could produce what would be sort of positive leakages, or actually I'm not sure it would be positive or good leakages, which would say instead of carbon emissions leaving the United States, carbon emissions just leaving the United States to countries without a carbon tax. There's a lot of research to show that higher, energy, raising the price of energy, accelerates innovation and reducing energy usage. If the United States is subject to a carbon tax, then you'll have a higher rate of development of these new green technologies, which then become cost-effective for developing countries much faster.
I firmly agree that if we were to impose a carbon tax, it would have some effect of spurring innovation. It's natural that when faced with higher costs, you're going to innovate to try to avoid those costs. No doubt about that. But what I think the problem here is, and it's my biggest issue, I think, ultimately with the carbon tax, is what is the appropriate price to place on the emissions? And what we see from the economics literature, disturbingly, is quite wide-ranging. There isn't really one number that qualified economists that are looking at these integrated assessment models have come to, in which they say this is what the cost to society of 1 ton of emissions is. I've seen numbers that range from as low as $8 per ton of greenhouse gas emissions up close to $1,000.
Yeah, so I think it is a real point that there is a degree of subjectivity in determining a social cost of carbon. But I think with you want to talk about, I guess, political constraints. I think there is a reality constraint on the estimates of the social cost of carbon that could actually be at all relevant to policymaking. I think that there's an argument from, I guess, some opponents of a carbon tax, which says that this would be an extremely damaging policy that would it would have such a large impact on households and the economy broadly. And then on the other hand, that it's so unpopular and politically toxic that no one would ever propose it. And I think there is a grain of truth in both of these points, but I think when taken together, I think that they sort of conflict with each other. I think that there are political difficulties with selling a carbon tax, but at the same time, those political difficulties preclude some of the more extravagant assumptions to produce such a high social cost of carbon estimate. And then the second point is, again, that the revenue doesn't disappear. And I know that it's a legitimate point to say, that the revenue, would it be used in the sort of perfect blackboard scenario? Probably, that's a challenge. I mean, I'm going to argue for the revenue to be used in the best possible way, of course, but it's unsurprising that political process being what it is, some of it. But if you look at the use of carbon tax revenue around the world, usually at least half of it, or roughly half of it, goes into reducing tax burdens. And that's in countries, I think, that have a much lower default hostility to taxation, I think, than the United States does. And so I think that it's not a foregone conclusion, I think, that a lot of the revenue or majority of the revenue or whatnot would be squirreled away to pet projects.
All right, let's take some questions from our viewers. Our first question comes from Danielle Gillis, who writes, when President Biden rejoined the United States to the 2015 Paris Climate Accords in 2021, the United States resumed its commitment to reduce greenhouse emissions by 26 to 28% by 2025. Can the United States meet these commitments without the imposition of a carbon tax? And if so, how? Jordan, let's let you start.
Well, the first thing I point out is that we are on a long-term trajectory of reducing our greenhouse gas emissions. 2005 to 2008 was the period when our greenhouse gas emissions were highest. We've seen significant changes in market dynamics for electricity generation that has led to a proliferation of more affordable natural gas and has displaced higher emitting coal. That has given some tailwind to emissions reduction. We also have a lot of policies in place. The result has been that we've already reduced emissions by somewhere between 15 and 12% from that 2005 level. Now, getting to this even deeper cut, or all the way to net zero, that's going to require massive intervention into our economy. There was a recent proposal on Capitol Hill that discussed some changes that would accelerate our emissions reductions to probably get to a 40% by 2030 number. There are a lot of ways that we can reduce emissions, and some of them are the things I've pointed to so far. Things like improving the availability of permits for clean energy projects. Things like improving the availability of housing in dense walkable environments. There are also a number of policy levers we can use, some of which would be overly harsh and could get us there but at too great of a cost, some of which may not be consequential enough. If you amp up a carbon tax high enough, there's no doubt it can reduce your emissions significantly. But what is the cost of amping up that carbon tax? The cost is that it reduces your overall economic productivity, it makes you poorer.
And Alex, do you believe that we can get to our proposed targets without the use of a carbon tax regime?
Well, I think that there is a question of, the variable here, of course, is always technology, which is somewhat unpredictable. So hypothetically, we could, have these sudden super fast advancements in green technology that would suddenly say, well, I guess we did. I guess we could. I think that over time, a carbon tax is, I believe the number in the question was 2025, which I think seems like a pretty short time frame for any emissions reduction policy that wouldn't, produce a very sudden shock to the economy. The thing about carbon tax is that, I guess sort of going off of Jordan's original point, I think the value of things like these entrepreneurial ideas to reduce carbon in the economy, that's great that that's already happening to some extent. But the fact is that there should be happening more, and that's effectively what a carbon tax does, is to say, that those sorts of projects should be rewarded with should have higher returns because, and should attract more investment because of their value. It's great that people are doing that already, but I think and the carbon tax is, of course, a broader incentive to do that, rather than the existing or proposed policies to do that, which tend to be much more targeted, thinking about tax credits specifically for different types of renewable energy. And a carbon tax would sort of neutralize those things and be much more, I think, consistent with the market price system, that the market price system should reflect those, the values of those investments.
Our next question comes from Charlotte Tyson, who writes, currently, my home state of New York is one of 11 states that have created and participate in the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, which is a carbon pricing regime. The Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative has reduced carbon emissions in these 11 states and also created net economic benefits from the program. Is this a good model to consider when developing a federal carbon pricing regime? Let's start with you, Alex.
Well, I think it would probably depend. I'm mostly focused on federal policy, so I'm less versed in the specific details of those programs. But I think with something as large as I think state level policy has a role to play, but I think that the transferability of the lessons from a state level program might be harder to draw and apply to the country as a whole.
And Jordan, your thoughts on state carbon pricing regimes?
Well, we have seen some states attempt to directly adopt carbon pricing. The state of Washington has had a couple of referenda that have proposed this, and they've failed miserably. The Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative is an interesting example. It is very limited in scope. It applies to a certain number of industrial enterprises, primarily power plants. But the empirical case is far less sewn up than our questioner suggests. I think there are issues with the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, like the leakage that Alex described earlier. When you have a regional plan in place, there are incentives for businesses and for households even to flee to non-taxing or non-jurisdiction areas. So if you live in Pennsylvania and RGGI is implemented, you may find yourself drawn to move to Ohio, somewhere that doesn't have that policy in place. And the evidence will bear that out. I can't speak specifically to the degree to which that leakage has occurred, but that's something you do need to be aware of. And whether it's the case that it's directly contributed to economic well-being, that's highly unlikely. How great the costs have been, I'm not going to make too strong of a case there, though.
And now it's time for Answer This, where each guest asks a question directly to the other. Let's start with Jordan.
Alex, I'm going to forego the opportunity to try to catch you in a trap here, and I'm going to ask you a genuine question that I'd like to know your answer on. Why do you prefer a carbon tax over a cap-and-trade approach to emissions reduction?
I think generally a price, sort of more a tax rather than the cap-and-trade system of allowances, I think tends to be more stable for markets tends to be more stable for markets and sends a clearer signal across the economy, I think, than a cap-and-trade system has. And I think also generally when we've looked at cap-and-trade systems versus direct sort of carbon taxes, generally I think the carbon taxes have performed better on a variety of metrics.
And Alex, now your turn. A question for Jordan?
So I think you've made some great points about these sort of alternatives to a carbon tax, about getting the government sort of out of the way, where the government is already in the way of investing of private investment in either renewable energy or carbon capture, or just ways that make our lifestyles less carbon intensive or energy intensive. Are there policies which you believe we should enact to go sort of beyond that? Or are you content with, okay, well, we've accomplished, major zoning reform and we've gotten better public transit and we price roads properly? Is that sort of and we do, permitting reform also, is that just sort of the end goal? Is that, okay, we'll pack it up here? Or are there other policies that you believe the government needs to sort of more actively take to reduce emissions?
As I've described through our conversation, one of my big focuses would be on local air pollution, which is related but not coterminous with greenhouse gas emissions. So I would focus my attention on these direct environmental harms first. Then I would consider what the landscape looks like once we have done everything we can to preserve clean air for our local environments.
And now it's time for We Agree, where each guest names something the other said that they agree with. Who'd like to start?
I'll start. I think, hinted at this before, but I very much agree with your point about zoning and the importance of housing construction and density and reducing carbon emissions. And I think much in the same way that sort of policy that can both significantly increase growth and also reduce emissions, I think zoning reform is probably like the biggest free lunch you could possibly sort of imagine.
And Jordan?
Despite all of my criticisms of the carbon tax, I agree with Alex that relative to our existing regime of a hodgepodge of subsidies and various regulations imposed on our energy system, a simple carbon tax would be more economically efficient than the existing regime. I do not agree that it is the best way for us to go forward, but our existing regime is so bad that a carbon tax would smooth things out considerably.
Well, that's all we have time for. We'd like to thank Jordan McGillis of the Manhattan Institute and Alex Muresianu of the Tax Foundation for joining us to discuss this issue. And thank you for watching Scholars Mate. I'm Eric Miller, and we'll see you next time.